Imagine this. You are standing in the shadows of a marble palace in Alexandria, watching as a 21-year-old woman orchestrates the most audacious seduction in human history. The year is 48 BC, and the most powerful man in the world, Julius Caesar, believes he's conducting a routine diplomatic meeting. What he doesn't know is that every detail of this encounter has been meticulously planned for months. The incense burning in bronze braziers isn't chosen for its pleasant aroma. It contains psychoactive compounds that heighten desire and cloud judgment. The wine isn't ordinary vintage, it's laced with aphrodisiacs extracted from rare plants that cost more than a Roman villa. Even the positioning of the furniture, the lighting from oil lamps, the strategic placement of mirrors reflects surfaces to create the most flattering angles. Everything serves one purpose: to transform a political alliance into an intimate obsession. Picture this scene unfolding before your eyes. Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the man who crossed the Rubicon, sits completely unaware that he's about to become the target of seduction techniques so sophisticated they would make modern psychological warfare experts take notes. The woman orchestrating this performance is Cleopatra VII, but she's not the exotic beauty Hollywood imagined. She's a brilliant strategist who speaks 9 languages, holds a doctorate in mathematics, and has spent years studying the intimate weaknesses of powerful men. What you're witnessing isn't just seduction. It's the weaponization of desire for political domination. Think ancient courtship was all about natural charm and coincidental attraction? Think again. What Cleopatra deployed against Caesar and later Mark Antony was so systematically calculated, so psychologically manipulative, that it makes modern dating strategies look like child's games. The methods she used involved neurological manipulation, chemical enhancement, theatrical staging, and psychological techniques that tap into the deepest primal instincts of the male brain. These weren't the romantic encounters sanitized in history books. They were precision-engineered psychological operations where every touch, every glance, every word was designed to create addiction-level dependency in the most powerful men of the ancient world. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Egypt was collapsing economically, surrounded by Roman enemies and facing complete annexation. Cleopatra's seduction wasn't about love or even lust, it was about survival. Failure meant the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the enslavement of her people, and the complete destruction of everything her ancestors had built over 3 centuries. Success meant transforming Egypt's greatest threats into devoted protectors willing to sacrifice their own careers, reputations, and lives for her kingdom. What you're about to discover goes far beyond the sanitized versions taught in schools. We're diving into the actual techniques documented in papyrus scrolls, the chemical formulations recorded by palace scribes, the psychological manipulation strategies passed down through generations of Ptolemaic women. You'll learn how Cleopatra used controlled starvation to heighten sexual response, how she employed theatrical techniques to create mystical experiences, how she manipulated brain chemistry through carefully administered substances, and how she created emotional dependency through calculated vulnerability and strategic withdrawal. These methods were so effective that Julius Caesar, a man who had conquered most of the known world, abandoned his political ambitions in Rome to spend months in Alexandria. Mark Antony, co-ruler of the Roman Empire, eventually chose suicide rather than live without her. The seduction techniques Cleopatra deployed didn't just win her temporary protection. They created such obsessive devotion that these men literally restructured the ancient world to serve her desires. The historical documentation reveals techniques so manipulative, so psychologically sophisticated, that they challenge everything we think we know about ancient relationships. Cleopatra didn't rely on physical beauty or chance encounters. She created comprehensive psychological profiles of her targets, studying their childhood traumas, their deepest fears, their unfulfilled desires. She employed teams of specialists, philosophers who understood human nature, physicians who knew how brain chemistry affected emotion, actors who could create perfectly scripted, intimate encounters. The encounter with Caesar began months before they ever met. Cleopatra's intelligence network had been gathering information about his personal preferences, his intimate habits, his emotional vulnerabilities. They discovered his childhood fear of abandonment after his father's early death, his need for intellectual stimulation from women, his attraction to power and exotic mysticism. Armed with this psychological profile, she designed a seduction campaign that would exploit every weakness while making him believe the attraction was entirely natural. Her first strategic decision was the famous delivery in a carpet, but the reality was far more calculated than romantic legend suggests. The carpet wasn't chosen randomly. It was woven with specific patterns that created optical illusions designed to disorient and intrigue. The timing wasn't spontaneous. It was scheduled for late evening when Caesar's judgment would be impaired by fatigue and wine. Even her positioning when she emerged was choreographed to maximize visual impact while maintaining an aura of vulnerability that would trigger his protective instincts. The psychological manipulation began immediately upon their first meeting. Cleopatra had studied Caesar's communication patterns and mirrored his gestures, speech rhythms, and emotional responses. This neurological mimicry creates subconscious comfort and attraction, making the target feel understood at a deep level. She presented herself as intellectually curious about his military campaigns, asking questions that allowed him to demonstrate his expertise while subtly flattering his achievements. Every response was calculated to feed his ego while establishing her as someone worthy of his attention. The physical environment of their encounters was engineered for maximum psychological impact. The palace chambers where they met featured acoustics designed to make whispered conversations feel intimate and conspiratorial. The temperature was carefully controlled to encourage the removal of outer garments while maintaining comfort. The lighting from oil lamps was positioned to cast flattering shadows while making direct eye contact feel intensely personal. Even the furniture was arranged to encourage gradually closer physical proximity throughout their conversations. But Cleopatra's masterstroke was her use of scent as a psychological weapon. Ancient Egyptian perfumers had developed formulations that contained naturally occurring pheromones and mild psychoactive compounds. These weren't simple fragrances. They were chemical formulations designed to trigger specific neurological responses. The scent she wore during their first encounter contained compounds extracted from blue lotus flowers, which induce mild euphoria and heightened sensuality. Caesar associated this unique scent with the pleasure of their meeting, creating an unconscious addiction that made him crave her presence. The strategic vulnerability she displayed was perhaps her most sophisticated manipulation technique. Cleopatra presented herself as brilliant and powerful, but haunted by the same fears that plagued Caesar. She shared carefully crafted stories about her childhood isolation, her burden of responsibility, her fear of betrayal by those closest to her. These weren't random confidences. They were precisely chosen revelations that mirrored Caesar's own psychological wounds. This created an illusion of deep spiritual connection that transcended mere physical attraction. Her intellectual seduction was equally calculated. Cleopatra engaged Caesar in discussions about philosophy, mathematics, and military strategy, but always positioned herself as an eager student rather than an equal. This satisfied his need to be the dominant figure while demonstrating her intellectual capacity. She asked questions that led him to reveal his deepest ambitions and fears, information she would later use to position herself as essential to his ultimate success. The physical seduction was delayed strategically to build tension and desire. Their early encounters involved minimal physical contact, carefully orchestrated to seem accidental but leave lasting sensory impressions. A brief touch while examining a map, fingers brushing while reaching for the same scroll, standing close enough to feel body heat while discussing military formations. Each contact was designed to increase anticipation while maintaining the pretense of purely intellectual interaction. Now that you've witnessed how Cleopatra systematically dismantled Caesar's psychological defenses, you're beginning to see the patterns hidden in history's most famous seductions. If uncovering these buried techniques of emotional manipulation resonates with your curiosity about human psychology and political strategy, Subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into the real methods that shaped world events. The psychological warfare waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about influence, attraction, and the hidden mechanics of power. When Cleopatra finally allowed physical intimacy, it was orchestrated as the natural culmination of intense intellectual and emotional connection. The setting was her private study, surrounded by scrolls and astronomical instruments, reinforcing their bond as fellow scholars. The transition from conversation to intimacy felt inevitable rather than planned, though every moment had been carefully choreographed. She had studied Caesar's preferences through her intelligence network and tailored the encounter to exceed his expectations while maintaining an aura of spontaneous passion. The chemical enhancement of their intimate encounters went far beyond simple aphrodisiacs. Cleopatra employed a sophisticated understanding of how various substances affect human psychology and physiology. The wine they shared was infused with damiana, a natural compound that increases blood flow and sensitivity. The oils used for massage contained extracts from plants that heighten tactile sensations while inducing mild euphoria. Even the foods served were chosen for their psychoactive properties: figs and honey that boost serotonin levels, exotic spices that stimulate circulation and heighten awareness. Her technique of strategic withdrawal was perhaps the most psychologically devastating weapon in her arsenal. After establishing intense intimacy with Caesar, Cleopatra would suddenly become unavailable, citing urgent royal duties or religious obligations. This wasn't rejection. It was calculated deprivation designed to create obsession. Caesar, accustomed to having his desires immediately satisfied, found himself craving her attention with an intensity that surprised him. The unpredictability of her availability made every moment in her presence feel precious and desperately sought. The religious and mystical elements of her seduction served multiple psychological purposes. Cleopatra presented herself as the reincarnation of Isis, the Egyptian goddess of magic and motherhood. This wasn't mere role-playing. It was a sophisticated manipulation that elevated their relationship beyond the merely political or physical. By positioning herself as divinely chosen, she created a psychological framework where opposing her wishes felt like defying the gods themselves. Caesar, despite his Roman skepticism, found himself drawn into this mystical narrative that made their union feel destined rather than calculated. The strategic use of gifts and luxury served to create a psychological dependency through sensory addiction. Cleopatra introduced Caesar to pleasures unavailable anywhere else in the ancient world. Rare foods that stimulated unique combinations of taste and texture, fabrics so fine they felt like liquid against the skin, perfumes that created entirely new olfactory experiences. These weren't simple luxury items. They were carefully chosen to create sensory memories that could only be satisfied in her presence. Caesar began to associate ultimate pleasure and satisfaction with being in Egypt, with being near her. Her mastery of theatrical presentation transformed every encounter into a performance designed for maximum psychological impact. When Caesar expressed interest in her naval capabilities, she arranged a demonstration that was actually an elaborate seduction. The royal barge was decorated with gold and precious stones that caught the Mediterranean sunlight. She appeared dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, served by attendants costumed as nymphs and cupids. The display wasn't about impressing him with Egypt's wealth. It was about creating a fantasy experience where she was the central figure in a divine spectacle. The psychological profiling techniques Cleopatra employed would impress modern intelligence agencies. She maintained detailed records of Caesar's emotional responses, his preferences in food, wine, entertainment, and intimacy. She noted which topics made him passionate, which memories made him melancholy, which ambitions drove his decision-making. This information was compiled into what we would now call a comprehensive psychological profile, allowing her to predict his reactions and manipulate his emotional state with surgical precision. The isolation technique she employed gradually separated Caesar from his usual sources of counsel and comfort. She provided him with luxuries and pleasures that made Rome seem austere and demanding by comparison. She introduced him to intellectual and sensual experiences that were unavailable elsewhere, creating a form of psychological dependency. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she became his primary source of satisfaction, advice, and emotional support. When he thought about returning to Rome, he was simultaneously contemplating giving up everything that had come to define pleasure and meaning in his life. Her strategic use of jealousy was particularly sophisticated. Cleopatra would arrange for Caesar to witness other powerful men seeking her attention, but always in controlled circumstances where he could observe her apparent disinterest in their advances. This technique simultaneously demonstrated her desirability to other powerful figures while reassuring him of his special status. The jealousy this created intensified his desire to possess her exclusively, while making him feel uniquely chosen and superior to his rivals. The pregnancy with Caesarion represented the ultimate psychological and political masterstroke. Whether the child was actually Caesar's or strategically timed to coincide with their relationship, its existence created an emotional bond that transcended mere personal attraction. Caesar, who had struggled with fertility in his Roman marriages, saw the child as proof of their special connection and his own virility. The pregnancy transformed their relationship from a temporary alliance into what felt like a permanent bond with stakes that extended beyond their individual lives. The economic integration strategy ensured that Caesar's personal satisfaction became tied to Egypt's prosperity. Cleopatra gradually involved him in Egyptian trade networks, agricultural improvements, and architectural projects. She made him personally invested in Egypt's success by making their partnership essential to projects he had become emotionally committed to completing. Caesar found himself in the position where abandoning their relationship would mean abandoning important achievements and investments that had become part of his identity. Her mastery of timing and communication was crucial to maintaining psychological control. Cleopatra never immediately responded to Caesar's letters or requests for meetings. Instead, she calculated delays that would create anticipation without causing anger. She studied his psychology carefully enough to know exactly how long she could make him wait before his desire turned to frustration. This timing was so precise that Caesar often found himself more eager to see her after delays than he had been originally. The religious festivals and ceremonies she arranged served as elaborate psychological theater designed to reinforce her power and mystique. During these events, Caesar witnessed thousands of Egyptians treating Cleopatra with religious reverence, bowing before her as a living goddess. The psychological impact of seeing her worshipped by masses of people elevated her status in his mind beyond that of a mere political ally or romantic partner. She became something approaching divine, making opposition to her wishes feel not just politically unwise but spiritually dangerous. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Cleopatra faced the challenge of transferring her psychological techniques to a completely different target. Mark Antony presented unique challenges because he was aware of her reputation for seducing powerful Romans. His psychological profile revealed different vulnerabilities. Where Caesar had been intellectually driven and emotionally guarded, Antony was hedonistic and emotionally volatile. Cleopatra would need to completely redesign her approach while maintaining the core principles that had proven effective. The famous meeting at Tarsus represented the culmination of months of intelligence gathering and strategic planning. Cleopatra's spies had provided detailed information about Antony's preferences for spectacle, luxury, and dramatic presentation. They had studied his intimate habits, his drinking patterns, his response to different types of entertainment. Armed with this psychological profile, she designed a seduction that would overwhelm his senses while positioning herself as the ultimate fantasy made manifest. The Golden Barge was not simply a display of wealth, it was a carefully engineered psychological weapon designed to create sensory overload and emotional vulnerability. Every detail was calculated for maximum impact. The gold reflected sunlight in patterns that created almost hypnotic visual effects. The purple sails were dyed with the most expensive pigments available, creating a color so rich it seemed otherworldly. The scents from burning incense contained psychoactive compounds that induced mild euphoria and heightened receptivity to suggestion. Cleopatra's costume as Aphrodite was psychologically brilliant because it transformed her from a foreign queen seeking alliance into the goddess of love herself. This wasn't mere theater. It was psychological programming designed to bypass Antony's rational defenses and appeal directly to his subconscious desires. When he looked at her, his brain processed not just an attractive woman, but the embodiment of every fantasy about divine feminine power and sexuality. The acoustic engineering of the barge enhanced the psychological impact of her presentation. Musicians were positioned to create sound that seemed to emanate from the water itself, as if the gods were providing a soundtrack to her arrival. The rhythm of the music was specifically chosen to match and gradually accelerate human heart rates, creating physiological arousal that Antony would unconsciously associate with her presence. The strategic use of servants costumed as cupids and sea nymphs created a complete fantasy environment where normal social and political rules seemed suspended. Antony found himself transported into what felt like a divine realm, where Cleopatra was the central figure. This psychological displacement made rational evaluation of their political relationship extremely difficult, as his brain was processing the encounter as a religious or mystical experience rather than a diplomatic meeting. Her delayed appearance on the barge was calculated to build anticipation to an almost unbearable level. Antony was kept waiting while experiencing increasingly spectacular displays designed to heighten his expectations. By the time Cleopatra finally appeared, his psychological state had been carefully prepared to receive maximum impact from her presentation. The timing was so precise that her appearance felt like the answer to desires he hadn't fully conscious he was experiencing. The feast she arranged for their first private dinner was an exercise in sensory manipulation that would make modern neuroscientists take notes. Every element was chosen for its psychological impact: foods that stimulated specific neurotransmitters, wines that enhanced emotional openness, scents that created unconscious associations with pleasure and safety. The progression of the meal was designed to gradually lower inhibitions while heightening sensitivity to touch, taste, and emotional connection. The conversation techniques she employed with Antony were completely different from those she had used with Caesar, demonstrating her sophisticated understanding of individual psychology. Where Caesar had responded to intellectual challenge and strategic discussion, Antony was motivated by emotional intensity and dramatic narrative. Cleopatra positioned herself as the protagonist in epic stories of divine love and heroic adventure, with Antony cast as the legendary hero worthy of such a goddess. Her strategic use of vulnerability with Antony was calculated to appeal to his need to be seen as a protector and savior. She revealed carefully chosen fears about Roman threats to her kingdom, presenting herself as a powerful queen who needed a worthy champion. This wasn't weakness. It was a sophisticated manipulation that made Antony feel simultaneously powerful and necessary. She had studied his psychology enough to know that he was motivated by the opportunity to play the hero in dramatic circumstances. The physical seduction with Antony was far more immediate and intense than her approach with Caesar, reflecting her understanding of his different psychological makeup. Where Caesar had required intellectual connection before physical intimacy, Antony responded to immediate sensory gratification. Cleopatra orchestrated encounters that overwhelmed his senses with luxury, pleasure, and variety, creating experiences so intense they became addictive. The psychological dependency she created with Antony was based on her ability to provide increasingly extreme and exotic experiences. She introduced him to pleasures and entertainments that were unavailable anywhere else in the ancient world, then made access to these experiences dependent on maintaining their relationship. Antony found himself psychologically addicted to a lifestyle that could only exist in her presence, making separation feel like a return to deprivation and boredom. Right now, you're feeling the weight of these revelations about history's most sophisticated psychological manipulations. This discomfort you're experiencing is the recognition of how power and seduction intertwined in ways that shaped the ancient world. If you want to continue confronting these uncomfortable realities that traditional history tried to sanitize, subscribe to keep accessing these hidden testimonies of human manipulation and political survival. Because what comes next will reveal techniques that make modern influence operations seem primitive by comparison. The religious theater Cleopatra created around their relationship elevated it beyond mere personal attraction to something approaching divine mandate. She convinced Antony that their union was blessed by the gods, specifically that they were the reincarnations of Dionysus and Isis destined to rule together. This wasn't casual role-playing. It was comprehensive psychological programming that provided religious justification for any political or personal decisions that served their partnership. Her mastery of gift-giving as psychological manipulation involved presents that created ongoing dependency rather than simple gratitude. She gave Antony access to trade networks that made him personally wealthy, but only as long as their alliance continued. She provided him with military resources that enhanced his reputation, but made it clear that these advantages disappeared if he betrayed their partnership. Every gift was strategically designed to make ending their relationship feel like personal and professional suicide. The isolation techniques she employed gradually separated Antony from Roman advisors and traditional sources of support. She provided him with Egyptian counselors who were actually her agents, advisors who appeared to serve his interests while actually advancing her agenda. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she replaced his entire support network with people who were fundamentally loyal to her, leaving him psychologically dependent on her for guidance and validation. Her strategic use of children as emotional leverage was particularly sophisticated. The twins she bore, Antony, created emotional bonds that transcended political calculation. She ensured that he spent significant time with the children, allowing paternal instincts to develop that made him emotionally invested in their welfare. Any threat to Egypt became a threat to his children, making opposition to Cleopatra feel like endangering his own family. The economic integration she achieved with Antony was even more complete than what she had accomplished with Caesar. She made him a partner in Egyptian trade ventures, agricultural projects, and mining operations. His personal wealth became tied to Egypt's prosperity, making her kingdom's success essential to his financial well-being. She had studied his psychology enough to know that threats to his economic status would trigger deeper anxiety than threats to his political position. Her manipulation of information flow ensured that Antony's understanding of Roman politics was filtered through her perspective. She controlled what news reached him from Rome, emphasizing information that made him feel betrayed or threatened by former allies while minimizing reports that might encourage reconciliation. This information management gradually convinced him that Egypt was his only true refuge, and she was his only reliable ally. The entertainment and luxury she provided created such intense sensory satisfaction that Rome began to seem austere and demanding by comparison. She arranged hunting expeditions, philosophical discussions, theatrical performances, and intimate encounters that provided constant stimulation and pleasure. This wasn't mere hedonism. It was calculated to make Antony psychologically addicted to a lifestyle that could only exist in her presence. Her timing of major relationship developments was crucial to maintaining psychological control. When Antony showed signs of considering return to Rome, she would announce pregnancies, arrange spectacular celebrations, or create crises that required his immediate attention. These interventions were so perfectly timed that they seemed like natural developments rather than calculated manipulations, but they consistently prevented him from making decisions that would threaten their partnership. The psychological programming she employed convinced Antony that their relationship was historically significant beyond mere personal happiness. She positioned their partnership as a new model for governing the ancient world, a fusion of Roman military power and Egyptian wealth and wisdom. This grandiose narrative made their relationship feel like a world historical mission rather than a temporary alliance, making any betrayal feel like abandoning humanity's future. The network of spies and informants she maintained in Rome ensured that she was always several steps ahead of potential threats to their relationship. When Roman senators moved against Antony, she knew about their plans before he did. When Octavian prepared propaganda attacks, she was ready with counter-narratives. This information advantage allowed her to seem prescient and indispensable, while positioning herself as his only reliable source of intelligence about threats to his position. Her mastery of creating shared enemies was particularly effective in solidifying their bond. She identified Octavian as a mutual threat and provided evidence of his plans against both Egypt and Antony. This wasn't entirely fabricated, but she amplified and interpreted Roman political developments in ways that made cooperation between them feel like the only path to survival. By creating an external enemy, she made their alliance feel necessary rather than convenient. The final psychological manipulation was her strategic approach to their deaths after the Battle of Actium. Even facing defeat, she maintained psychological control by positioning their suicide as a choice of honor rather than an acknowledgement of failure. She convinced Antony that dying together was the ultimate expression of their divine love, that their deaths would make them immortal examples of true passion transcending political circumstance. Even in death, she managed to control the narrative and transform their defeat into romantic legend. The effectiveness of Cleopatra's psychological techniques is demonstrated by their lasting impact on world history. Her relationship with Caesar resulted in Egypt avoiding Roman annexation for another 2 decades and established her son as a potential heir to Caesar's power. Her partnership with Antony created a political alliance that controlled half the Mediterranean world and came close to defeating Octavian's forces. These weren't temporary infatuations that briefly influenced powerful men. They were comprehensive psychological operations that fundamentally altered the political landscape of the ancient world. The sophistication of her methods challenges modern assumptions about ancient psychological understanding. Cleopatra employed techniques that wouldn't seem out of place in contemporary intelligence operations: comprehensive psychological profiling, strategic information management, neurochemical manipulation through controlled substances, environmental engineering for maximum psychological impact, and long-term relationship dependency creation. Her success demonstrates that ancient rulers had access to psychological knowledge that in many ways exceeded what was available even a century ago. The historical documentation of her techniques comes from multiple sources that allow us to reconstruct her methods with surprising accuracy. Roman historians, despite their political bias against her, provide detailed accounts of her psychological strategies. Egyptian papyrus documents describe the substances and preparations used in her seduction campaigns. Archaeological evidence from her palaces reveals the environmental modifications designed to enhance psychological manipulation. These sources combine to create a comprehensive picture of systematic seduction as political warfare. The ultimate lesson of Cleopatra's psychological warfare is that she understood something fundamental about human nature that transcends historical period or cultural context. She recognized that powerful men, regardless of their intelligence or experience, remain vulnerable to techniques that appeal to their deepest psychological needs and fears. By studying her targets carefully and designing comprehensive manipulation campaigns, she could create emotional dependencies that override rational political calculation. The modern relevance of her techniques is both fascinating and disturbing. Elements of her psychological manipulation strategies appear in contemporary advertising, political campaigning, and even personal relationship dynamics. The understanding that environment, timing, scent, intellectual engagement, strategic vulnerability, and calculated unavailability can create powerful psychological influences remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Alexandria. You came into this exploration thinking ancient seductions were simple matters of beauty and opportunity, and now you leave understanding the systematic psychological warfare that shaped world history. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these hidden historical realities matter. If this journey into the sophisticated manipulation techniques of the ancient world has awakened your appetite for truth about how power really operates, subscribing means you'll continue accessing these revelations that demonstrate the timeless patterns of human psychology and political control. Your curiosity about the real mechanisms behind historical events deserves to be fed with accurate analysis of how influence, attraction, and power actually work, rather than sanitized fairy tales about romance and coincidence. Cleopatra's legacy as history's most effective psychological manipulator rests not just on her individual victories, but on her demonstration that comprehensive understanding of human psychology could overcome seemingly impossible political odds. A small kingdom surrounded by the greatest military power in history survived and thrived for decades because one woman understood how to identify, target, and systematically exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of powerful men. Her techniques weren't magical or mysterious. They were the practical application of sophisticated psychological knowledge to political problems. The true horror and brilliance of her methods lies in how completely she could reshape the priorities and loyalties of men who had spent lifetimes building political careers and military reputations. Caesar and Antony weren't weak or naive individuals easily swayed by feminine charm. They were among the most intelligent, experienced, and psychologically resilient leaders in human history. That Cleopatra could reprogram their fundamental motivations and decision-making processes demonstrates psychological manipulation skills that remain unmatched in recorded history. Understanding Cleopatra's real methods forces us to reconsider not just ancient history, but the nature of power, influence, and human psychology itself. Her success reveals that systematic psychological manipulation, when applied with sufficient knowledge and resources, can overcome almost any political or military disadvantage. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond historical curiosity into fundamental questions about human vulnerability, the nature of free will, and the hidden mechanisms that shape even the most important political decisions. In our own era of sophisticated propaganda, political manipulation, and psychological influence operations, Cleopatra's techniques serve as both warning and instruction manual. They demonstrate the power of comprehensive psychological profiling, environmental manipulation, chemical enhancement, and strategic emotional dependency creation. They show how individual relationships can be weaponized to achieve political objectives, and how even the most powerful people remain vulnerable to systematic psychological manipulation by those who understand their deepest needs and fears. The queen who made herself into a goddess, who turned her enemies into devoted lovers, who transformed military threats into protective champions, represents the ultimate expression of psychology as political weapon. Her story reminds us that behind every great historical transformation lie individual human relationships shaped by the hidden dynamics of influence, manipulation, and the eternal human needs for love, validation, and meaning that make even the most powerful among us surprisingly vulnerable to those who understand how to exploit our deepest psychological vulnerabilities.